Hi, in this video I'm going to go over questions that were submitted during the Crosby Institute Longevity and Wellness course that I wasn't able to answer. Now, I should let you know that if there's questions sent in, our staff deleted any questions that weren't related to the topic. And also, sometimes questions were sent in, but the questions didn't make any sense. So it's a possibility if that happened to one of your questions, I might not be able to go over it with you. But anyways, let's go over some of the questions. So one of the questions that was sent in was, are there available tests for mitochondrial density status? The only thing I know that you can use to measure mitochondrial density status is biopsy. But there's no lab test that can do that. So it really involves tissue biopsy testing. It can be done in research studies, but not really in a clinical setting. Okay, next question. Will vibration stimulation exercise therapy, like the platform machine and smaller devices, address health span biological mechanisms, evidence of effectiveness? So I really don't know if there's any direct research that shows vibration stimulation increases longevity. It's pretty unlikely you'll ever see any kind of papers like that published, or anyone taking the time and effort and research and research time to do something like that. But, you know, there is definitely clear indication that falls are a common cause of death in the elderly, especially as people age, and the older they get, especially past age 55, 60, it's in the top 10 causes of death. So, you know, vibration stimulation exercise therapy, if it's improving balance in someone who's got some instability, maybe something that can be very useful. And that's probably as far as you can go with like evidence and effectiveness. So platform devices that vibrate and really increase proprioceptive input can be something that can be very useful for people that are starting to decrease integration with their vestibular system, the cerebellar system, or their proprioceptive systems. And for people that have different types of neuropathies, they can also make their sensory pathways more efficient with that kind of stimulation. But I think it would only really be critical for health span from a perspective of reducing risk of falls. Okay. Should there be an instrument developed for baseline psychological resiliency based on what habits of thinking expectation a person has subconsciously ingrained from childhood? So I think there are some questions and some things associated with psychological resiliency to some degree, but not the context of how we were presenting it in the course, or how I was presenting it in the course. It'd be great if someone can develop that mechanism. And, you know, for me, and I don't know how many of you practice, but there's really a thin line between practicing functional medicine and diving into psychology and personal life and really crossing that barrier. And of course, you know, the mind-body issues, mind-body mechanisms are very important, and you have to look at your patient's lifestyle and those factors. But, you know, taking a really big, deep dive in that can sometimes completely change your dynamics of your practice and your relationship with your patients and all those things. So typically what I will do with certain things is just to emphasize support for those types of mechanisms. Like if I really feel like there's not a functional biological mechanism, like an underlying like mood disorder or neurochemical imbalance that could be causing psychological resiliency issues, it's not my expertise and specialty. So, you know, with all of us at some point have to decide what are we good at, what things should be handled by other people. And for me, I don't like to take deep dives into psychological related issues, and there really needs its own effort and its own expert and its own specialty to identify those things. So we just have some general screen issues that we use in the course. How do you know what scales are for determining where a patient is on the continuums of overlapping patterns of resilience, stress response, sleep resiliency, psychological resiliency? So we don't really have a scale system developed. The purpose of you know, some of those diagrams and slides of looking at things are just conceptual. They're not validated in any way. We don't have any validated forms to do that. To validate different types of resiliency with every single one would require an entire team and lots of research and lots of time. But the purpose is just to really get an idea of how severe and significant something is. Obviously, you know, you can see who's someone who's not sleeping at all and just can't get any proper deep sleep and is having really significant issues with it, and it's happening almost every night. and they're having 1 to 2 hours of sleep is much worse than someone who's maybe sleeping 6 hours every night, but is off maybe once or twice a week. So just those general standards. So I don't know how you would have specific scales for that, but the information presented was really just more for the conceptual mindset of different degrees of resiliency. Okay. Is there a state of cognitive freeze decline where a person can't change their mind behaviors? Something that can be seen on functional MRI like PTSD, hyperintensities in a particular region. So, I don't know. I don't know of anything you can use objectively to diagnostically measure can't change your mind or behaviors. Now, the ability to change in mind and behavior is such a multivariate models of so many different things. I don't think you're going to be able to find like one specific region in the brain that is directly associated with that specific behavior. We have general things like when we understand about the brain, we know like fear and anxiety can be regions of the amygdala, but it's very general. So to get that specific, and I don't know, and even like executive functions where you can change and be flexible, it's hard to say. I don't know of anything, let's just say that. And as far as functional MRI studies, I'm not aware of that either. So it's just not my area of expertise, and I can't really answer that for you. Hyperintensities in any particular region, for sure. I don't think you're going to ever find anything that specific. Okay. Would a lack of psychological resiliency in a person who had an authoritarian upbringing due to psychological lesions or the effect of upbringing? I don't know. Basically, would the brain age faster both functionally and physiologically, or can it be pure psychological? Again, like these types of questions, I don't know. It's like the chicken egg question: how much does psychology impact physiology? How much does physiology impact psychology? Obviously, they have some degree of intertwined responses with them. At the end of the day, it really, when you look at a patient who's chronically sick and chronically ill, you're never going to figure out every single thing to help them, and you don't have to. The body is always trying to attain homeostasis. So in the functional medicine model, we're trying to see what parts of their physiology is not working, try to optimize it, and hopefully that can give them the fuel or physiological efficiency to attain homeostasis on their own from their normal responses. And that's kind of all we can do in a functional medicine model. Like to get into like deep psychological lesions from an authoritarian upbringing, that is not really, that's really more into the specialty of psychology than it is to functional medicine, which we're trying to really focus on during the course. Okay, what are your thoughts about the Galleria as a multi-center early detection test that screens for common cancer signals offered by GRAIL? What are your thoughts of the utility of such liquid biopsies? Yeah, so we mentioned this test in the evaluation section of the course when we're looking at wellness and looking at early detection for cancers. I think liquid biopsies will definitely be the future. The biggest issue right now is just cost. And, we know we can get these liquid biopsies like the Gallery GRAIL test for like $1,000 cash price. So that doesn't allow it to be utilized by many people in the population, and hopefully as time goes on, the cost will go down. I spoke with some of the people who work with the company, and they're constantly trying to find ways to lower their price. Everything takes time. Like whenever we were able to, in the 80s, measuring a single nucleotide polymorphism, was hundreds of thousands of dollars, and now it's like 15, 20 cents, and you have things like 23andMe that can be used by the general population relatively inexpensively. So I'm pretty sure over time we're going to have liquid biopsies be the future, and it'll hopefully be part of a routine screen, and that's what researchers are focusing on doing, is trying to optimize the technology to bring the cost down so it can be used as a screening marker. And they realize that one of the mechanisms that's delaying its use is just the cost. So we have to really save cost. But as far as the science goes, the early clinical trials they have done on it seems really positive, and I think it's something to consider for yourself if you haven't done one, and it may be something you do regularly for yourself. Okay. What are your thoughts on shockwave therapy, on the inflammation process, and even stem cell exhaustion on joints? So, shockwave therapy, from what I understand about it, is just going to like stimulate tissue, which can help with healing and releasing growth factors. I don't think it's going to have really any significant difference on inflammation, where you have lots of protein aggregates and GABA aging. Releasing growth factors aren't going to change that. The main thing that's going to change that is to try to promote autophagy. There's no way shockwave therapy is going to... I can't imagine, I should say. Can't imagine how any kind of shockwave therapy that can be very good for healing is going to promote autophagy. So really autophagy signals and those genetic expressions to turn on those pathways, it's very clear that they happen in caloric restriction states. There's not really anything else. And trust me, they have studied it for many mechanisms that have been shown to really clear that garbage cells or GABA aging. So the shockwave therapy maybe as it releases growth factors can reduce some of the inflammation, but it's not going to, I don't think, get rid of the debris. And as far as stem cell exhaustion goes, I'm not really sure on joints. It could be possible. It could be, the shockwave therapy can potentially impact genes that impact joint or cartilage stem cell exhaustion. I couldn't believe, I wouldn't imagine there's so much research on that yet, but hopefully as time goes on, they can investigate those types of things. I think it could be possible. It could have some impact on specific cartilage cells, but I don't know. If you see chronically low levels of globulin and white blood cell, is that a sign that there's reduced immune system function from stem cell exhaustion, or is it just if the patient is not recovered normally from exposure to infections? That's a really good question. And, if you see low levels of, first of all, let's talk about white blood cells. If you see low levels of white blood cells or any kind of specific white blood cells like neutrophils or lymphocytes, or just all of them are typically low, or total white blood cells counts low, in an elderly person, you definitely could have some degree of immune senescence that's taking place, especially if it's consistently there all the time. If you see it in someone young, it's not stem cell exhaustion. However, the pattern could look exactly the same if someone has like a chronic infection, a chronic pattern. A lot of people have chronic viral responses that completely suppress their white blood cells for extended periods of time. So you kind of have to look at their history and see if they have any patterns of like a viral infection, their history. The other key thing you will see if it's like an infection is when you look at their T B cell profiles, you might see a pattern that reflects an infection, whereas even though their total white blood cell count could be low, the helper cells are up, the suppressor cells are down. Those are things that happen during a pathogen exposure, but not specific to stem cell exhaustion. Stem cell exhaustion, you would probably just see all the different immune cells and total white blood cells low, and then because the total white blood cells are low, the absolute levels are going to be low, and then the percentages may be totally normal when you look at a white blood cell. Low levels of globulin, you're going to have to specify what type of globulin it is. Is it hemoglobin? Is it immunoglobulin? You could do something like a protein electrophoresis to look at different fractions of globulin and the proteins to get a clue. But those are specific for elevations and not necessarily for low levels. If you see the total immunoglobulin count low, like IgG, IgM, IgA, that would explain the globulin levels being low. So there's a little bit of overlap, and ultimately all you can do is see if you see signs of infection with like helper cells, suppressor cells down, and look at their history. But yeah, I understand the confusion here, and I think it's tough to distinguish that in some cases. Okay, if a diabetic already has significant beta cell loss, would a 3-day fasting still help with reset? No. Not really. I mean, the 3-day fasting cells is really trying to get that growth hormone, insulin, IGF pathway, insulin receptor site response to be more efficient. It's not really specific to the beta cell loss. So I just think it's completely a different mechanism altogether. I mean, there could be some possibilities it has some impact, but it's not directly related to that. And of course, you could be extremely careful with any kind of fasting with someone who's diabetic with insulin needs and demands, and I think so. Anyways, I think those are the main things I can say to answer that. Okay, if an individual has lots of food intolerances due to hyperimmune activation from mold toxin illness, how can they maintain proper nutrition if they have to avoid those foods to decrease overall inflammation? Okay, so yeah, if someone's reacting to a lot of foods, how do they maintain proper nutrition? So, really depends on what you define as proper nutrition. Like if you refer as proper nutrition having minerals and nutrients and antioxidants, then for sure you can do that supplementally. If you're referring to like proper nutrition being, foods that can change microbiome diversity and different flavonoid richnesses and some of the, diverse polyphenols in foods that we just can't necessarily get simply by, taking a multivitamin, then there could be some potential issues. I think you just do the best you can. I don't think you're going to have severe malnutrition, even if people limit their foods. You can typically get most micronutrients and sources from limited foods that they do have, but sometimes you do have to supplement, and their inflammation is really, really significant in a scenario like that. So I personally wouldn't be as worried about it. I'd be more worried about the mold toxin illness and the inflammatory response, and if need be to use supplemental nutraceuticals to deal with any type of nutrient imbalances. Okay. What are your thoughts on using mean platelet volume as a biomarker for aging on routine CBC? It has potential. The mean platelet volume decreases with immune senescence and aging over time. It's just hard to see what that number is. There could be people who've like made charts and plans of how that looks. I'm just not aware of that. But there's definitely some use of looking at mean platelet volume to look at immune senescence. I just don't know what those levels are, and I've never used them in my practice, or know how even to apply it in an actual clinical setting, other than there's some associations with that changing with aging. You mentioned folate, but studies show doses of 1 gram increases risk of prostate cancer. What are your concerns with the folic acid doses? Yeah, I know what you're referring to. You're referring to the study that was done with prostate cancer. And, the study had, first of all, the incidence of prostate cancer was not statistically significant. And to me, it was like really a bunch of hype. And I remember it was like a small sample of, I don't know, a few, like 200 or 300 people, like 9 people more with folate had it, but it didn't reach a p-value that actually mattered, so it could have just been due to random chance. And they did find statistically significant relationships where dietary folate intake reduced risk, so there was that inverse relationship. But a lot of papers get published when they show like nutraceuticals are bad and cause some harm. There's no way in the world a paper that shows no statistical significance would be considered valid. I think in that paper they said something like, well, we acknowledge the fact that this was a small sample size, and it's possible that this can be, a factor, but we need more research to really conduct, if this is there with a greater population sample, to see if we can actually reach statistical significance. But that's a lot of what ifs. So I'm not concerned about that in any way. From the one paper I remember reading. However, there could be other studies, but again, these types of studies to me, like the one I mentioned, they pop up all the time. So for me personally, I'm not worried about that 1 gram. Now you said studies. I'm not aware of multiple studies on this. I'm aware of one that got a lot of attention. And every now and then you see these papers pop up where they find like, oh, vitamin E can increase cardiovascular disease risk. And this is when you look at studies, also you have to remember, first of all, this study did not reach statistical significance, the one that got a lot of hype about folate and prostate cancer. But, in all research studies, they use the p-value, and they use the p-value of 0.5. And even if the study was statistically significant, because of that p-value, it means like 1 out of 20 study designs will have results that are not accurate. And this is why, the highest level of evidence is multiple studies where you have a composite score like a meta-analysis. And with most information, I try to share in the courses, I always try to find meta-analysis studies first, so we can avoid that p-value inaccuracy that takes place just from statistical design. In any case, I'm not worried about it. Okay. According to the hallmarks of aging model, why would vagus nerve stimulation help with major depression? So I don't think the hallmarks of aging have anything to do with vagus nerve stimulation helping with depression. Vagus nerve stimulation is going to activate parasympathetic activity and cause autonomic changes that may have an effect on some people with depression. I don't think it has anything to do with hallmarks of aging. So, okay, second part. How would one determine the intensity, duration, etc. to improve the various putative mechanisms that impair physiological function related to major depression? I don't know. So listen, with any kind of intervention you use, there's always some degree of trial and error. Every single person's unique. Every person's different. Remember, in functional medicine, we're practicing individualized, personalized medicine. And in a real clinical setting, there's multiple variables involved for various interventions. And, it's just the way it is. It's not always going to be clear. You're going to have to try some things and see what works as far as intensity and duration and etc. And, work through a case. That's all we can really do. Okay, do you recall apps like Chronometer to track foods and see whether a patient is meeting macronutrient targets? I don't use any of those apps. They may have some use for patients. It just depends on the patient population you're working with. You only get so much energy from each patient. And if you start having a patient do a lot of these things, which may be cool to look at, you could really fatigue him from doing other things you really need to happen and change your case. So the type of practice you have will kind of let you determine how much of your patient's psychological capacity and endurance you want to use for various things. So I don't do much of that. I'm really trying to deal with them getting out of crisis care or trying to look at various mechanisms, and we're not really trying to look at their macronutrient targets. But if you had more of a nutrient-oriented health optimization, I think it could be useful to some degree. But also remember, just because they're getting the macronutrient exposure doesn't necessarily mean that they're absorbing it and they're assimilating it, and those macronutrients are getting or meeting all the needs that they have. So, for example, like people that have diabetes or even metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance, they have very high excretion of things like magnesium, choline, inositol, B vitamins, and their levels of need may not be will be the same as someone that's getting the macronutrients targeted for the generalizable population. So I think a lot of these food tracking apps are looking at the general population. When people have individual chronic conditions, they could have depletion of various nutrients that just may not be identified with these apps. You're better off, doing things like you could do a dietary intake and use the app, but you can also add in things to that, like a red blood cell micronutrient test, where they can actually measure their mineral and vitamin status in the red blood cells, which is considered the gold standard for nutrient status. Okay. Is there a risk of disturbing the GI microbiome with berberine? So I don't know how you would define risk. Every single botanical we take has an impact on the microbiome. Every single one. So when you look at the papers published on it, and they actually study the microbiome, everything you ingest will change your microbiome. Your lifestyle factors of how much sleep you get will change your microbiome. Exercise changes your microbiome. So the word disruption, I think, is the key thing. So there's definitely going to be changes with every type of botanical impacting the microbiome. And, it depends on what they're looking at. So the problem with some of these gut studies is they'll look at one species of bacteria, see one species of bacterial species go up or go down, and it doesn't really mean anything. And when you really look at the Human Microbiome Project, they have to use machine learning to try to interpret what all these different variations in bacterial species have on each other. It's not like one's good, one's bad. They'll have different effects on each other. For the most part, berberine has been shown to have really powerful effects on different receptors in the gut and G-coupled proteins in the gut that really modulate metabolism, make it more efficient. But for some people, they may cause adverse reactions, and you will probably definitely get. All of us have had the patient who takes some botanical, and for them, they have severe abdominal symptoms that aren't like anyone else's, and it's probably disturbing their microbiome unique to them from their baseline microbiome status, and even some of their genetic microbiome sensitivities, and some of the different microbiome species that involve with diet, and everyone's going to be a little bit different. But I personally am not really worried about a risk of disrupting the GI microbiome with berberine. I think for the most part, it's going to be beneficial, and depends what the overall goals are. So I hope I answered your question. Okay, when homocysteine levels are in the triple digits, what kind of irreversible damage can be expected to the endothelium, neurons, and other systems, and how might this compare to moderate to advanced lupus cases? What therapeutics could be introduced other than B vitamins for bringing homocysteine levels in the range? First of all, if homocysteine levels are in triple digits, that is a genetic disorder. That is absolutely not like a normal clinical response. First thing I would do if I saw homocysteine in triple digits is send him to a genetic specialist to look for these rare disorders. I would have to find. It would be so rare. I've never even seen or heard of that in clinical practice. I wouldn't even know where to send him to. I'd have to look into it, but that's not normal. That would have to be like some kind of genetic variant. I'm not sure what kind of irreversible damage it would cause. Obviously, homocysteine levels being elevated can cause significant inflammation, destruction to neurons and tissues. And I wouldn't know how I don't know how it would compare to moderate to advanced lupus cases. I would guess it's not going to be as bad as lupus cases. Triple digit homocysteine is a serious problem. I would be surprised that they don't have like massive vascular injury and multiple strokes with levels that high. And homocysteine was initially discovered at Mass General Hospital by the pathologist there, who saw, I believe it was like a 7-year-old that came in that had retinal detachment and a stroke. And then the pathologist that's not normal. We don't know what's happening. So they did some testing, and checked all the different biomarkers that he could find in his pathology lab. And he found the homocysteine levels were high. And there was one other case like this, I think, 20 or 30 years before, and the pathologist had saved tissue samples from that case, and then he found that person also had high homocysteine, and that initially started that whole homocysteine mechanism of heart disease. And then this is Killer McCulley, the researcher that did this, and then he started to do a study where he injected pigs with homocysteine at just slight elevations, not slight elevations, but significant elevations, but definitely not triple digits. And these pigs ended up having the strokes and heart attacks within a relatively short period of time. So, anyways, that's the best I can answer that question. And I think if it's triple digit, B vitamins are not going to necessarily be enough. I would definitely look into. You're going to have to consult with a genetic specialist for that. Okay. And I'm not sure if you're referring to homocysteine levels that we're using in the U.S. or if it's different in Europe or other countries. But in the U.S. scale, we don't get 3-digit elevations of homocysteine. Okay. If not using dark field microscopy and live blood analysis for insights on cellular function, which specialty tests provide the most broad spectrum insights that we can rely on in terms of accuracy? So, microscopy, blood analysis, they're really looking at the function of cells underneath a microscope. It's totally different than when we do lab tests that are looking at what's in the quantity of what's in the blood, and so forth. I just think they're completely different types of testing altogether. As far as accuracy, that's such a general question. What specialty tests provide the most broad spectrum insights in terms of accuracy? I don't know. They're looking at different mechanisms altogether. I don't think you can correlate that test with other types of biomarkers. Each, you can't, a fasting glucose is completely different than T3 levels. You're just looking at completely different physiological mechanisms. So I don't know how to answer that. I would say I don't think there are things that are comparable that can be used to look at the same types of mechanisms. Okay. Leptin is often coming up as a longevity hormone, I've heard that even a bit of herbal alcoholic tincture can throw off one's leptin on a given day. Okay. With diet and lifestyle, what recommendations allow for optimal leptin sensitivity? So leptin is directly related to your insulin sensitivity and how efficient you are of using your endocrine response to a blood sugar drop or shift. So, body fat, adipocytes work with hypothalamic pathways via leptin, and insulin signaling and growth hormone pathways all have a role to do with that. So I would say, what diet and lifestyle regime would you allow for optimal leptin sensitivity? Whatever stabilizes blood sugar and insulin levels, ideally. So I think it would be completely identical to all the things people are doing for managing insulin sensitivity, like exercise, working out, and improving the insulin signaling pathways, reducing the carbohydrate load. Those would be all the same things. Okay. And as far as like even a bit of herbal alcohol tincture can throw off one's leptin on a given day. I mean, I don't know. Where did someone come up with that? Someone did a study on alcohol herbal tincture, and they measured someone's leptin levels, and then like these are just random stuff that's out, and I don't know about that. Okay. Doesn't one need a certain baseline of inflammation for kidney function? Okay. Well, you need a certain degree of inflammation for all types of functions because you have to get rid of some debris and you have to be able to fight infections and pathogens. Okay. What is the risk of dropping inflammation too low with nutraceuticals? You're not going to drop inflammatory markers too low with nutraceuticals. It's just not going to happen. Wasn't there a kidney disease in endurance runners linked to reducing inflammation too low taking aspirin and ibuprofen? I'm not aware of that, but in any case, that's a multi-variable mechanism with endurance runners. They have so many different things that are happening with their physiology. And, aspirin and ibuprofen are probably having some type of antiplatelet effect. But you're talking about the extreme of the extreme, like in extreme endurance athletes. And I'm not I'm not sure about the endurance athletes and aspirin and ibuprofen. I just know that information won't be generalizable to the normal general population. And I don't really see how you could drop someone's inflammatory load to the point it's a risk for them with any nutraceutical. Okay. Do marijuana smokers have shortened telomeres? So in general, I can tell you when I was doing my literature, I was reviewing the literature, make sure I got all the relevant papers for this longevity course. And marijuana smokers, the studies that I remember reading on marijuana were smokers, and they used like tobacco and marijuana smokers together, and they considered it to be a risk factor, and it's potentially the oxidative stress. But also in the literature, there are papers in reference to cannabis potentially helping with aging processes and turning opioids. So I don't think it's very clear yet. Obviously, smoke is never good, and smoke is a free radical, but I think when you look at the cannabinoid activity of marijuana, there's probably a lot of potential there to have some immune modulating, anti-inflammatory effects on tissues that can be very supportive. So as far as what I remember reading, I think there's some issues. There are a couple papers with just marijuana smokers, but I'm not sure if they're chewing cannabis or using cannabis medicinally in different forms, if it has an effect. There isn't like an explosion of research on various things that increase or decrease telomeres, just so you know. Okay, I hope I answered all your questions. Thank you for submitting them. And if I wasn't able to answer your question, I apologize. We were probably not able to understand it or was unrelated to the topic. Thank you.